Ottawa has chosen a far quieter move, one that is proving far more deeply damaging to the US economy. Canada has quietly withdrawn from voluntary supply chain coordination mechanisms that had underpinned the smooth functioning of North American manufacturing for nearly 7 decades. In a very short period of time, the effects began rippling through the US industrial system in ways no political explanation could soften. This is no longer a trade dispute that can be settled with a tweet or a brief press conference. It is a direct confrontation between high-risk political calculation and the unforgiving laws of the real economy, and it is unfolding far faster than the US administration ever anticipated. Automotive assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio have been informed that shipments of critical components may face extended delivery delays with no clear timeline. There are no canceled orders and no formal bans, just delays applied in a way sufficient to disrupt the entire rhythm of production lines. When the whole system is built around just-in-time delivery with virtually no inventory buffers, even a delay of a few days is enough to bring factories to a standstill. Without parts, vehicles cannot be assembled. As those components are held up at the border, roughly 20,000 workers are forced to sit idle, while their incomes are almost immediately cut off. Construction firms across the United States are also beginning to realize that shipments of steel and lumber from Canada are no longer being cleared on schedule as stipulated in their contracts. Multi-billion-dollar projects have abruptly stalled, triggering delay penalties, cost overruns, and a domino effect spreading across entire development portfolios. Energy markets reacted almost immediately once traders grasped that the minimum supply of Canadian oil and natural gas could no longer be taken for granted. That uncertainty alone was enough to shake pricing models that depend on stability above all else. Prices surged not because supply was actually cut, but because confidence and reliability evaporated in a very short span of time. The root of this crisis does not lie in a technical malfunction or an ordinary trade dispute. It is the result of an ultimatum. The Trump administration delivered what it described as a final demand to Canada, insisting that Ottawa accept limits on exports of strategic materials unless US companies were granted preferential access at prices below market value. Consider what that demand truly implies. The US government was asking Canada to sell its natural resources for less than their real value in order to serve a political message in Washington, not to address an acute supply shortage, nor to stabilize markets in an emergency, but to force a sovereign country to subsidize American industry by sacrificing economic value that rightfully belongs to Canadian workers and shareholders. When Canadian officials reviewed this proposal, they understood clearly that accepting it would not only inflict economic damage but also place the nation's foundations in jeopardy. Accepting such conditions would have set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden at any time whenever a US president judged political pressure to be advantageous. That was a line Canada refused to cross, and the very moment Ottawa said no, the fragility of the entire US production system was exposed in a way that could not be concealed. At this point, the limitations in how the Trump administration understands the modern economy became starkly and painfully clear. In tightly integrated supply chains, the sheer size of an economy does not automatically translate into power. In practice, the country that controls critical inputs at strategic choke points often holds far greater leverage than the one that owns the final consumer market. Regardless of any gap in GDP, Canada happens to sit precisely at those critical nodes. From energy and minerals to automotive components and construction materials, these are inputs that US industries cannot easily replace. Not in the short term, not within a few months, and in some cases, substitution is virtually impossible without committing vast amounts of capital and waiting many years. Yet ultimatums continued to be issued as if Canada had no choice but to yield, as if differences in economic scale alone were enough to guarantee submission. That way of thinking ignores a fundamental reality of modern manufacturing. The system operates with extreme fragility, where the absence of a single small component can be enough to bring an entire factory, employing thousands of workers, to a complete halt. As the effects began to spread across the US economy, a rare development emerged in corporate boardrooms at the highest levels. Chief executives who had previously remained silent in the face of Trump's trade threats were now placing constant calls to Congress and the White House, not to debate ideology or political strategy, but to lay out stark operational realities. If the situation continued, factories would be forced to shut down within days. The consequences would be immediate: tens of thousands of workers would be pushed into temporary layoffs. At the same time, competitors in Europe and Asia who had not driven themselves into this spiral of disruption would quickly seize market share that US companies would have little chance of winning back. These were not hypothetical warnings designed to gain leverage in negotiations. Those calls were accompanied by hard data, inventory levels, production schedules, and contractual obligations that could no longer be met. The numbers exposed a clear reality. The current system has virtually no capacity to absorb shocks when a supplier once considered stable suddenly becomes unreliable. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was forced to issue emergency statements. Manufacturing associations followed with forecasts showing that hundreds of thousands of jobs were at immediate risk of disappearing. Industry coalitions that typically avoid open political confrontation began publicly urging the administration to reverse course before the damage became irreversible, and the consequences of turning trade policy into a spectacle became too obvious to ignore. Because when a factory shuts down, no narrative can make it start running again. When a worker is furloughed without pay, no slogan can help cover a mortgage payment. And when energy prices rise because supply is no longer guaranteed, American consumers feel it immediately in their heating bills and at the gas pump. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that it follows a familiar pattern we have seen many times before. Threats are issued without a clear exit strategy, from tariffs imposed on China that left US farmers dependent on government bailouts, to hardline warnings at the Mexican border that nearly paralyzed the automotive supply chain, until pressure from the business community forced the administration into an awkward retreat. Canada, however, is fundamentally different from the adversaries in those earlier confrontations. The level of economic integration is far deeper. Mutual dependence is far more comprehensive. And in Ottawa, there is no political will to accept capitulation. This combination has produced a crisis that cannot be diffused with bluster or last-minute stopgap deals. As real economic damage begins to surface, even the political foundation beneath Trump is starting to show cracks. Republican senators from the affected states have publicly called for an immediate solution. Labor unions are issuing repeated warnings about an imminent wave of large-scale layoffs. And corporate leaders who once lavished praise on Trump's hardline approach have begun to quietly distance themselves, not because they have suddenly changed their beliefs, but because their financial statements are bleeding red and shareholders are demanding answers. This is the point at which the display of power collides head-on with the realities of practical governance. Coercion that leads to economic breakdown is not a sign of strength. It is a mark of failure. The deeper issue, and one that will linger long after this immediate crisis passes, is the message Canada's response is sending, not only to Washington, but to the entire network of US allies watching every development unfold. Today's level of economic integration with the United States now carries political risks that traditional diplomatic channels are no longer equipped to manage, and once governments and corporations around the world have absorbed that lesson, it will not simply fade away. Companies begin to reconfigure their supply chains, governments accelerate the diversification of their trade relationships, investment flows gradually shift toward jurisdictions that still offer policy stability. Quietly but decisively, the world begins to build economic systems that are less dependent on the reliability of the United States, because reliability itself is the true measure of power in global markets, and that measure is being eroded in plain sight. What is unfolding is not merely a bilateral dispute between two governments. It is a moment in which a structural vulnerability is being exposed, one that has always existed, but has never before been tested on this scale. It is the vulnerability of an economy that long assumed cooperation would endure, even when voters elected leaders who openly dismissed the value of that cooperation. The consequences of this contradiction are emerging faster than anyone anticipated, reshaping incentives, alliances, and strategic calculations across North America in ways that will be difficult to reverse. Because once trust is replaced by contingency planning, once reliability becomes conditional, the old model of integration will never fully return. What makes Washington particularly uneasy at this moment is the absence of a clean exit and the lack of any clever maneuver that could change the situation without acknowledging a profound defeat. The entire strategy was built on the assumption that Canada would eventually yield, that differences in economic scale alone would be sufficient to compel Ottawa's compliance. And when that assumption collapsed, it simultaneously revealed an uncomfortable truth. Behind the hardline rhetoric lay a striking absence of viable fallback options. The US administration now finds itself trapped between two options that carry roughly equal costs, continuing to escalate or being forced to retreat. Whichever path is chosen, the political price is real, and there is no longer any way to conceal those consequences from the American public. If Trump follows through on his threat to impose sweeping tariffs, the damage to supply chains will accelerate sharply. Factories that are already operating on the edge will be forced to shut down entirely. Layoffs will spread from the industrial Midwest into the energy and construction sectors. Consumer prices will continue to rise across a wide range of goods. And the argument that this is all merely a temporary negotiating tactic collapses under the weight of lived economic experience. Americans see it when their factories close, when construction projects stall, and when the cost of living rises month after month. These are not abstract economic indicators that can be explained away at political rallies. They are everyday realities that can destroy political support. But if Trump attempts to de-escalate, quietly withdrawing the ultimatum, or negotiating a face-saving compromise, he confronts a different kind of political calculation. His entire political identity has been built on the idea that he never backs down, that threats always produce submission, and that American power is absolute. Any visible concession to Canada would be seized upon by critics and ultimately by his own supporters, as proof that coercive brinkmanship failed when confronted by a sovereign country willing to endure short-term economic pain to defend its long-term independence. At this point, the damage extends beyond the immediate economic shock and begins to undermine institutional credibility. Because allies around the world are not judging this crisis by White House press briefings or recycled political slogans. They are watching outcomes. They are observing whether the United States can sustain integrated partnerships without turning them into weapons, and whether American leadership understands the fundamental difference between leverage and self-inflicted harm. Within Washington, fractures are widening in ways that are deeply unsettling for a political system already strained by polarization. Trade experts who warned about this trajectory are now being proven right in real time. Lawmakers are scrambling to distance themselves from a policy they did not design, but for which they are now being held accountable by voters who are losing their jobs. And the constitutional imbalance that allows a single head of government to unleash this level of economic disruption before any meaningful checks take effect is being scrutinized more intensely than at any point in decades. With the courts moving slowly, Congress remains paralyzed by partisan division, and the economic consequences have been immediate and severe. What Canada has done, intentionally or not, is to push this crisis into the real economy, where ideology matters far less than logistics. And once a crisis enters that realm, containing it within political arguments becomes impossible. Trucks that fail to cross the border do not care about media strategy. Energy flows do not respond to rhetorical flourishes, and assembly lines do not pause politely while leaders recalibrate their political narratives. The most consequential impact of this confrontation may not be what happens in the coming weeks or months, but what unfolds quietly afterward. US companies are beginning to redesign their supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility, sourcing components from alternative suppliers even at significantly higher cost, building redundancy and inventories instead of pursuing maximum efficiency, and redirecting long-term investment toward jurisdictions where policy stability still holds. And once corporate decisions of this kind are made, they are rarely reversed. The integrated North American economy, which took generations to build, is beginning to fragment, not through announcements or dramatic headlines, but through thousands of quiet recalculations made in boardrooms across the country. Canada sees this shift clearly, which is why Ottawa has chosen not to sit back and wait for Washington to resolve its internal fractures. Canadian officials are actively accelerating trade diversification, expanding and deepening economic ties with Europe and Asia, to ensure that no future ultimatum from the United States can pose a systemic threat to Canada's economic security. The lesson drawn from this episode does not come from documents or theoretical models, but from harsh, lived experience. Dependence on a partner that treats interdependence as a tool of coercion rather than as a shared benefit is a fundamental vulnerability that must be reduced in a deliberate and structured way. Canada is not alone in recognizing this. Other US allies are reaching similar conclusions, extending well beyond the bounds of a bilateral crisis. For if the United States is prepared to deploy economically existential ultimatums against its closest neighbor, a country with a shared language, shared values, and the longest peaceful border in the world, then no ally can assume it stands outside that risk.